Good morning. The Apostle Paul was not a stranger to sea travel. In fact, he grew up in the city of Tarsus, which was just a few kilometers upriver from the Mediterranean Sea. And he and his family, when he was very young, would travel with his father, a Pharisee, and perhaps also his grandfather, also a Pharisee, 3 times a year down to Jerusalem to be there for the pilgrimage feasts. And most likely the 600 kilometers by sea was a 3-day journey one way, but back and forth up along the west coast, not only of Israel, but Syria above that, and all the way back to Tarsus. He also traveled on his 3 missionary journeys by sea, and no doubt incurred some difficult weather in some of those travels. In 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul recounts the things he's been through as an apostle, he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. 3 times. You got to wonder who's steering these boats. But anyway, we're going to see one of those shipwrecks, and it certainly wasn't the pilot's fault back then. So he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, probably hanging on to some piece of wood from a ship, or perhaps in the ship's boat, which we're going to read about in this passage. He managed to have a small boat that he could save himself in. He said, I was in frequent journeys, often by the sea. He says, frequent journeys in danger from rivers and in danger at sea. So Paul was familiar with the Mediterranean Sea. You ought to have an idea of the Mediterranean Sea just for your reading of the Bible's sake, so that you understand. And we're going to do that today. But I couldn't study this very far before it crossed my mind. Why spend 44 verses in chapter 27 and then 3 more specifically dealing with finally getting to Rome by boat in chapter 28? Why all this nautical language and all the details of the trip? And I think there are 2 reasons why Luke would have been burdened by the Lord to write all of this down as the Holy Spirit was directing him. First, the story does glorify God for his sovereignty and his faithfulness. Sovereignty, for those of you who may not be familiar with the word, is his rule over all things. And what we see is an example of what Pastor Logan read. He raises up the stormy winds. And that's what he does in this chapter. His control over the weather on the Mediterranean Sea. And the interesting thing about it is he had intended for Paul to get to Rome and be a witness to those in Rome right from the beginning. So why make a storm? Because there's something he wants to teach not only the Apostle Paul, but also Luke. We find out that Aristarchus is with them in the boat for years. I was shocked to realize at some point that Luke was in the boat with him. I thought Paul was there by himself as a prisoner in the boat. And I certainly didn't know that Aristarchus was there. You say, well, who's he? You remember when Paul and a bunch of the brethren took an offering down to Jerusalem to share with the brethren in Jerusalem because they were going through drought and famine. So Aristarchus was one of those brethren that's mentioned in Acts chapter 20. He was on the boat as well, and almost certainly stayed on the boat all the way to Rome with Luke. He had fellowship along the way. So one of the lessons is this mighty power of God to raise up a storm, and yet, just as Jesus told the storm on the Sea of Galilee to stop. I remember pastor in the church that I attended for 11 years when I was in seminary. The pastor said Jesus stood up in the boat and he said to the storm, "Shut up!" And my son, I think David was about 3 or 4, he turned and looked at me with big eyes. "Pastor Boyd needs a whipping. He said a bad word." Yeah, but that's okay for him. Hey, he stopped the storm. And not only, if you read that passage carefully in the Gospel of Matthew, he stopped the waves. He didn't just stop the wind from blowing and then it took a while for all the waves to settle down. No, he settled all the waves. It is a remarkable statement. And of course, this storm is too. In the second place, it illustrates how calming is the faith of a Christian in the face of even the most dire circumstances. How many of you have ever been in a ship on the ocean? Okay, not going out of the harbor, or maybe you got out into the ocean and then turned right around and came back. But out in the ocean, several of you have. I have, and there wasn't a storm, but we were on a terrible tack because we were kind of cattywampus to the waves. The waves were this way, and so the boat went up and down that way and this way, and I became acquainted with a condition called seasick. No fun. So about 2 or 3 hours into that storm, I called for him to please relieve me from steering. I was the one who was supposed to steer. Well, I really wasn't, we were not in any dire circumstance. But this was definitely a dire circumstance. And you have to know about boats back in the first century. They were not screwed together. They were not made fast. They were, boards were bound to the frame of the ship with wooden plugs coated with it was a waterproof, or as close to waterproof as they could get, wooden plugs. And you bang a hull like that on wave after wave after wave, and guess what happens? Yes, it becomes unplugged. And that's not good for a wooden boat that's plugged together. So, Paul tells the entire crew as the wooden ship is being driven by hurricane force winds, "I have faith in God." And how often are we in much less dangerous circumstances and we are terrified? Why? Well, this is not anything God really cares about. Someone told me recently, "How can you pray for a vehicle? I mean, you think God's going to come down and fix your vehicle? If he wants to, yes. But I'm not praying for that specifically. I just want him to work." And he does. I've divided the chapter into 3 sections, and if our brother would turn the lights off up here. This to me was the easiest way just to give you a little introduction to the trip. This is Israel down here, Egypt, this is North Africa there, and we go up. We call this Turkey today, but they called it Asia or Asia Minor is the more modern term for what it was called back then. This is where Paul was on his first missionary journey. If you cross the Aegean Sea, you're in Greece. And if you cross the Adriatic Sea, you'll hit Italy and Sicily. So just the layout of this. He leaves from Caesarea, and they stop at Sidon, and they sail up above Cyprus because the prevailing wind is coming from the south, and so they want to go on the other side of Cyprus where it's not so wind-driven. That's called being on the leeward side. This is the windward side if the wind's coming this way, and we'll run into those terms. And so they go real slow. They don't have much wind. They maybe have a bit of a headwind, so they can't proceed very fast. And they stop at this little town called Myra. They're trying to get up to Cnidus. It's got a C in front, but you don't say Cnidus. You just say Cnidus is the way it's pronounced. Say, how do you know that? I have Google. So that's how I know that. So anyway, they leave from Myra. They get a new ship. We'll talk about that. And they head from Myra down toward Crete, and they want to winter there. Why? Because starting in what we call October of the year, the Mediterranean Sea becomes a blender of stormy weather all the way through February, even into early March. Ships start sailing late March, early April. So they finally get to Cyprus, and they go underneath Salmone again. Why are they underneath the island this time? Because the prevailing wind is coming down from the Aegean Sea. So they stay on the leeward side of Crete. And when they get to Fair Havens, it's not accommodating to winter in. I mean, we're talking about 4 months, 4.5 months. They need to stay somewhere. And it's not just accommodating because all the sailors want to play pinball during the winter. It's not accommodating because there is a very open harbor, and in that harbor there are little islands, and there's really nowhere to put your ship to keep it out of all the wind and all the storminess. So they wake up one morning while they're in Fair Havens, and there's just a soft southerly breeze, and they want to make it over here to Phoenix, because Phoenix has a large harbor, and the whole harbor front is blocked by a large island. There's a southwest exit and there's a northwest exit, but you can put your ship in there and keep it safe. So they want to go to Phoenix. And so because the wind's blowing very soft, they say, ooh, we have a chance now. It's only 55 kilometers away. They could do that in a few hours in a sailing ship, no problem. And but it doesn't work. And that's where they hit the storm. When they're right up against the coast, they hit the storm. And before they know it, hurricane force winds start blowing. And they're coming in from the north, and they drive the boat away from the island. Now, anybody know how fast hurricane force winds are? It's not a hurricane force wind unless you're going how fast? 120 kilometers an hour. That's the beginning. That's what do they call the stage one hurricane? There's a name for that. Of course, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Stage 5 is make sure you have a will. So this, we'll see why we call it hurricane force winds. And we'll see how well they kept track of the boat all during this time until they get to Malta. And that's where we stop. So you can turn the lights back on, brother. I appreciate that. It'll be on behind me, but I'm not going to refer to the map anymore. Verses 1 through 12 are going to discuss the trip from Caesarea up to Myra, where they changed ships. Where am I? Yeah, it's right there. You can't see it. Don't worry about it. But that's the first part of the journey. Then from Myra, they go to Fair Havens, but remember, they don't stay there. They're trying to get to Phoenix. And so the second section from verses 13 all the way to 38, 26 of the 44 verses is the ship in the storm. And so this is good for us. By the way, let me just remind you of Charles and John Wesley. John Wesley was the founder of what evangelical denomination? Methodism. It wasn't, well, you could call it Wesleyism. Some of the churches call themselves Wesleyan churches. But they founded Methodism because they were very methodical about the way they evangelized. They were methodical about the way they lived. They were methodical about everything. John Wesley was methodical about everything. And so they started this denomination called Methodism. But how did they get saved? They got saved, or they were drawn by the Spirit of God to the first step of salvation in a ship in the Atlantic Ocean that was in a storm. And while they were in the storm, they met with a bunch of believers who were singing hymns and reading the scriptures. And they were amazed that these folks, men, women, and children, really happy, singing and having a good time while the ship, it looks like it's going to sink. And of course, John and Charles they're good Anglicans, but they're bad Christians. Because Anglicanism does not save. Jesus Christ saves. And they did not know him. But these folks in the boat did know him. And when they saw their patience and their calmness in spite of the storm, it affected them profoundly. And I think that's what happens here. They see how calm Paul is. They are encouraged by what he says, as we'll see. So all through this storm, down to verse 38, and Paul tells them at one point, he says, you're all going to be saved. None of you are going to die. But one of the things we find out is the owner of the ship was on the boat. And Paul says, none of you are going to die, but the ship's going to be lost. And I'm thinking, I bet that owner was really worried. You know, I don't know that he had any Manulife insurance for that boat. Whatever it was, they shipwrecked on Malta. Well, let's start in verse 1. We last saw Paul in Acts 26 making his defense before who? King Agrippa. Making his defense there, and the last thing in the chapter, verse 32, Agrippa says to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And Paul likely stood before Agrippa in the late summer, maybe late September, maybe early September. All we know is for a while they went slow, but we don't know what that means. How slow did they go? So the idea is he sails in AD 59 on a boat going to Adramyttium and say, whoa, where is Adramyttium? Well, we read in verse 1, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, and the we includes who? The we includes the author of the book of Acts, who is Luke, yes. And you'll find that all the way through this chapter and into the next chapter. In fact, Luke is on the boat. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners, we don't know who they are, to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Now, we meet another centurion in the book of Acts. His name was Cornelius. And remember that a cohort has 600 soldiers in it, and there was a centurion, 100. For every 100 soldiers, there was a centurion. So one of these, for that Augustan cohort, was a guy named Julius. And so they took ship, as I mentioned, in AD 59, and they headed out hoping to make a fast sail to Rome. But it doesn't work. Notice the expression that it was decided that we should go, an indication that this is Luke. But we also find out something in verse 2. And embarking on a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. If you look at Asia, it's gone. Thank you. Okay, don't look at Asia. But if you go up the west coast of what was Asia and what is Turkey today, Adramyttium was all the way at the top. And they were going to go to the various ports along that western coast as they made their way north to Adramyttium, which is right across from Macedonia. And so as they were getting on this boat, everybody was loaded in. They headed off. It was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia. We put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So Adramyttium was that city up in the north. Aristarchus was returning home to Thessalonica. He would have stayed on the first ship. If he were headed home, he would have stayed on the first ship because it would take him very close, just across the Bosphorus from his home in Thessalonica. But I don't think he stayed on the ship. And the reason is why when Paul writes to the Colossians, and it's a prison epistle, which means he wrote it in what city? He wrote it in Rome, and he says, Luke greets you, and also Aristarchus greets you. Why? Aristarchus was in Rome. He didn't get off the boat or stay on the one going north along the coast. He got off that boat onto the one going to Rome. And so the next day, after they had let go, verse 3 says they put in at Sidon. Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. So it wasn't like he was chained up like the rest of the prisoners, probably because he was a Roman citizen. So he was treated differently than the other prisoners. All right, putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus. Remember, they went over the north side. The lee just means where there's no wind. It doesn't refer to any direction, north, south, east, or west. It just refers to where there is no wind. The leeward side. And what's the other side called? The windward side. Okay, so now you know how they're traveling. Notice the expression along the coast in verse 2. They stayed close to the coast in case, especially this time of year, we're going from nice, warm southern breezes to stormy weather. And when does that stormy weather start? You know, when my sister and her husband came up here, my brother-in-law Alan taught a course for 3 months. My sister writes to me and she says, "When does winter start in Edmonton?" And I wrote her back and I said, October 22nd at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when winter starts. You don't know when it starts. It just comes. It comes in September and you go, whoa. And it comes in December and you go, ah. So, you know, they're trying to make provision for applying these waters safely. So anyway, they come to the port of Myra, but going from Cyprus to Myra is very slow. And that's not good. Very slow is not good. Why? Because it gets them closer and closer to the winter weather. So from Myra, they take on a new ship. Verse 7 says, "We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete." Again, under the lee just means the windless side, which on Crete was underneath Crete or south of the island of Crete. So they sailed there, and let's see, verse 8 says, well, let's go back a little bit. "We sailed under the lee of Crete off the city of Salome." It's also Salome is the way it's pronounced by some folks. So coasting along it with difficulty. We're trying to stay real close to land in case a storm springs up. "We came to a place called the Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea." So from Myra, near Cnidus, very slow going. And the problem is, by now, it's already into October, as we'll find out. So Julius and the ship's pilot have decided that since they can't stay in Fair Havens, that's not a good harbor to winter in, they try and make a dash to Phoenix. So they reached the eastern end of Crete. They sailed south of the island, hugging the shore and arriving at Fair Havens. But starting in verse 9, it becomes dangerous going. It was slow going before, but now it's dangerous going. Verse 9, "Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast," you notice that the word fast is capitalized? A fast to the Jews was a time of abstaining from food in preparation for a special feast. So one commentator in commenting on what this fast is, he said this referred to no doubt the fast in preparation for the great Day of Atonement, which fell in AD 59 on October the 5th. So it was not surprising that 14 days after leaving Fair Havens, the ship in which Paul was traveling wrecked on the coast of Malta, south of Sicily. So it was already after October 5th. How long after? Well, what if it was 2 weeks after or 3 weeks? What if it was the beginning of November? So why would they leave? Well, Paul advised them when they decided they were going to leave Fair Havens, Paul said, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Now, when Paul says this, he's speaking with all of his experience of the Mediterranean Sea, but he's not speaking by the Spirit of God. How do we know? Because he said there's going to be much loss, even of our lives. And that was not true. So this is him giving his advice. I don't think we ought to leave here. It's either late in October or it's early in November. I think we ought to stay here. But however he gave advice, verse 11 says, the centurion paid more attention to the pilot, and here is the nervous owner of the ship we meet, than what Paul said. Now, that's going to change. They're going to start paying attention to what Paul says at this point, because it happened that they got caught in this storm. Well, verse 12, because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in Fair Havens, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow, notice the wording, on the chance that somehow, with this enormously expensive ship filled with cargo for Rome, is going to make it, they put out to sea. Facing both southwest and northwest was the harbor at Phoenix, and they spent to spend the winter there. So they took their chance. So they come from Myra to Crete to Fair Havens, and then they make a dash for Phoenix, as I mentioned, because the wind blew softly from the south, and all they had to do was just spend a few hours. God saw to it that that was a mistake. And so notice the wording in verse 12. They ignored Paul's words and set out for Phoenix on the chance that somehow they could reach that. Was this wise? Well, we have the explanation for the whole trip, so we understand. No, that was not very smart. Sometimes people trust their experience a little too much. The storm at sea, verses 13 to 38. Section 1, I'm going to go from 13 to 20. From all hope, we hope to get to Phoenix, to no hope. And if you go down to the end of verse 20, they abandon all hope of ever being saved. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor. What does it mean to weigh an anchor? Why would they do that? I remember somebody asked, why would they weigh the anchor? It means to pull the anchor up and put it on the boat, or in modern parlance, they hang it from the hole that the anchor chain lets the anchor down by. So they weighed anchor, they pulled up the anchor, and they headed along the shore of Crete. And remember, they're trying to stay close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the Northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, they're trying to get back to the coast, but the wind was driving them backwards from the coast. We gave way to this wind and were driven along. A northeaster is a storm that comes from what direction? Northeast. Yes, that's why they call it a northeaster. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, on the eastern coast, and northeaster storms were always problematic because they were cold and they often did what they call a perfect storm, where they combine with a much warmer storm coming in from the south, and you have what's called, well, they call it a perfect storm. If I were on a boat, I would call it a very imperfect storm. But it's called a northeaster because of the direction that it came from, and it brought with it tempestuous winds. Well, the name or the Greek term for tempestuous is typhonikos. Typhoon. Yes, that's where we get our word from. A hurricane force called a typhoon in the Pacific Ocean, especially the western Pacific Ocean. They're called typhoons, but they are what we would think of as a hurricane. Hurricane force winds only start at 121 kilometers an hour. To be driven along means that they did everything they could to slow the ship down, as we'll see. And they turned the stern of the ship to the wind and the pushing of the waves, and they would just keep it steered straight. Up, up, up to the crest of the wave, because the wave's moving this way and it's carrying that ship forward. But when they go over the crest, down they race into that trough, and the front of the ship slams into the next wave. So this is the kind of travel they're facing. Again, they run under the lee of a little island named Cauda. They're trying to go for calmer water. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Now we have Luke and maybe Paul and Aristarchus, everybody helping to try and gain control of the ship under this circumstance. The ship's boat is what we would call a dinghy, a life raft, but this is not a raft. It's just a wooden boat built to provide a place where they can be safe if the ship is destroyed. And so they managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Well, where was it? I mean, you see this if you just look at sailboats traveling. They're towing the dinghy behind the boat. They've been doing that for thousands of years. So that's why they needed to bring the ship's boat in and bring it up and put it on the deck. They didn't want to lose it. It's not going to save everybody, but it could save some. And fearing they would run aground verse 17, after hoisting it up, they used supports, or the word is helps in the King James, to undergird the ship. What is that? Well, you take a nice sturdy rope, you feather it over the bow of the ship on both sides, so there are sailors here hanging onto this end of the rope and sailors there, and they let the water push the rope back about halfway down the ship's length, and then they tie the rope very taut across on top of the gunwales of the ship. Those are the sides of the ship sticking up above the deck. And what are they doing? They are tying the boat together. They're tying the ship together. If it continues to slam on those waves, it's going to fall apart. By the way, that's a bad thing to have happen in a boat that you're in, where the boat just falls apart. Not good. Who's going to get the dinghy? And there are 276 of them. So this is very difficult. Then it says they lower the gear. They didn't want to run aground on the Syrtis, so they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. So 4 things. They take the dinghy up. They use these helps or supports to hold the boat together. In the third place, they lower the gear. Now, first I need to explain this Syrtis. It's capitalized. There is this place north of what we call Libya today, and it was where the town of Cyrene is. We've seen that town mentioned in the book of Acts several times. Well, north of that, somewhere out in that ocean depth between Crete and Libya, is this place where 4 or 5 different currents converge. And because they converge there, they push sand, they push rock, and it creates a much shallower place. They were afraid they would run into that. So what they do is they have these very heavy weights on the boat, usually with iron, some metal, perhaps bronze. But the important thing is they're heavy. And they tie them onto the back of the ship and let them drag behind. And what does that do to the boat? It slows it down. And that's what they want to do. They want to slow the boat down. So that if they do see, how are they going to know that the water's shallow? Don't know if you've ever seen this. How are you going to know when the water reaches a shallow place? What happens to the water? The waves break. And so you see this disturbance on the surface. A friend of mine and I, we came from school down to South Carolina. I said, I'll show you this island where we go. And we're on our way out there. And he said, what's that flag? I said, that's a small craft warning. Well, aren't we a small craft? Yeah, we are, but I don't pay attention to the warnings. It's not that bad. And then all of a sudden we hit a place where it was shallower. And so these waves started breaking to our right as we got to the shallower water, and I had to turn the motor and go the way the waves were going. Now, we were okay, but my poor friend, he had his hands on either side of that boat and was pulling it in. Terrified. Well, multiply that many times, and that's what these folks are going through. And then fourth, see verse 18? Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison or throw overboard the cargo. They must have had perhaps other animals there or some other cargo there, but they were throwing everything overboard that didn't need to be on the boat. Why? That made the boat lighter, and that means it rode higher in the water. That's good. That's good. You want it to ride higher in the water. Now, that wasn't enough. Look at verse 19. By the way, what they didn't throw out was the wheat. They don't do that until right at the end of this story. So they did throw some things out, but not everything. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle out. This is ropes, pulleys, heavy weights, anything that they did not have to have. They would have thrown overboard with their own hands when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Now, we already know they're 3 days into this mess. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, not more than 11 days, no small tempest lay on us. And here they are. They started out with all this hope for Phoenix. And here they are. They abandoned all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. By the way, another story. This is exactly how John Newton began to come to Christ. He was in the North Atlantic on a terrible North Atlantic storm, and everybody knew that the ship was going to sink. It was falling apart, the ship was. And all of a sudden, John Newton began to think of all the verses his mother taught him before he was 7 years old. And he called out to God to save him. And the Lord does this. Say, I'm going through a terribly difficult time. The Lord does this to save sinners. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to tell people who are facing difficult times in their lives. I will read what John Newton said earlier in his life. He was a sailor for quite a number of years. In a storm at sea, this is what he wrote in his diary. We found that the water, having floated all our movables in the hold is everything under the deck. Everything that was movable under the deck, there was so much water down there that it filled up the hold, and all the casks of our provisions had been beaten in pieces by the violent motion of the ship. On the other hand, our livestock, such as pigs, sheep, poultry, chickens, and turkeys. I mean, imagine he's there sailing the boat, and there goes a pig, and there goes a cow, and, turkeys. What in the world am I doing out here in the middle of the ocean? Well, it might be better than being eaten. I don't know. You're going to get eaten by something under the water anyway. So they were washed overboard in the storm. In effect, all the provisions we saved would have only subsisted us but a week, and that at a scanty allowance. So we wonder why they hadn't had any food. It probably was not preserved in the storm. And not only when you're terrified do you not want a hamburger, maybe they didn't have that many provisions left, but we do know they had some. And so Paul stood up among us, or among them, and he said 4 things. Number 1, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. And you can hear the owner of the ship saying, amen. Number 2, verse 22, yet now, even though you did this against my warning, even though you did this, I urge you to take heart. And the word really means to be cheerful. It sounds like that guy, don't worry, be happy. Yeah, that's kind of hard to run by people in this circumstance. And so he says, take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Looking at the owner, yeah, your ship's going to be lost, but we'll all be saved. And now he tells them how he knows that. Verse 23, for this very night there stood before me an angel of the Lord to whom I belong, the Lord to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. What he said way back in Acts chapter 23, he's had this in his mind the whole time. I'm supposed to go there. God said I'm supposed to go there. So he obviously is going to keep me there, and the angel tells him that. Yes, that's right. You must stand before Caesar. And then the angel tells him, behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Can you imagine the blessing of saving the lives of 275 other people just because God wants you to survive? And he says, I know this is why we're going to be no loss of life at all. And then he says in verse 25, so take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Doesn't say where or when. This comforting message from Paul to the ship's crew did something that we will see. It made them trust Paul's word. Folks, as Christians, people ought always to trust our word. They should know we always tell the truth, or we always seek to tell the truth. So they go from hope in God in verse 27 through 38 to more hope in God. It's the first time he's addressed them. He's going to address them twice again after this to encourage them. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, as we were been, this is when they started in the storm. So the 14th night plus whatever was before they got to Crete and made the mistake of leaving Fair Havens. 14 nights from that, they were being driven across the Adriatic Sea. That's the sea between Greece and Italy. Okay? They went across the Adriatic Sea. In fact, when he says this, they are almost all the way across. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. How would you know you're getting close to land? You hear birds. And the closer you get, the more you hear the birds. But you also see stuff floating in the water. So there are ways you know, hey, we're getting close. Now it's nighttime, so they can't see that far. The storm is still upon them. And so the sailors suspect they're getting near land. So they took a sounding, have a long, small, not string, but a thin rope. They tie it to a weight at the bottom, and they have lots of this rope because they took a sounding. They measured the depth and found it 20 fathoms. A fathom is 2 meters. So they have enough line to put that thing down 120 feet before they know it hits the bottom. Sometimes they're heavy. They actually have these in a museum in by the Sea of Galilee in Israel. It's got a little tiny scoop at the bottom. So they know it hit the bottom and they know what's on the bottom when they pull it up. And it's got either mud or sand or something in that little scoop on the bottom. And a little farther on, there's actually a guy who in the early 1800s took this chapter, and he had been his whole life sailing on the Mediterranean Sea. And, oh my, okay, forget that story. I just saw the time. Okay, they took another sounding, and it was only 15 fathoms, so they're getting closer, but I think still miles away. And we, fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the rear, again, to slow or stop the boat's progress. And this would further keep the boat from running aground. They had the rudders tied together, and they untied them. Verse 30, the sailors were seeking to escape. They didn't believe what Paul said. They were trying to put the ship's boat in the water. And notice what in verse 31 Paul said to the centurion. He said, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And all at once, they take their swords and cut the boat off, plop down in the water. The boat is gone. No more life raft. So they did what? They listened to what Paul said. Then in verse 33, as the day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense, in a continual state of expecting the worst, is the idea of that word. That's got to be hard. I mean, 24 hours a day for 14 days, you're not eating anything, so you're not in your right mind anyway. And they always were expecting the worst. And without food, having taken nothing, Paul says, therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. Literally, this will give you salvation. They're about to jump off the boat and swim to shore, and they haven't eaten in 14 days. not a good situation. So, and then he tells them in verse 34, therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, and not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all. This is a witness. He did it in front of them. By the way, when you go out to eat, you bow your head, you return thanks for the food you're eating, even though somebody might be watching you. You should. You should. He did this in front of them all. And he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some. We were in all, Luke says, 276 persons. And when they'd eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So this is where they did that. So now they're as high up as they can be out of the water, and that's so that they can get closer to the beach before they run aground. And verse 39, and when it was day, they did not recognize the land, still several kilometers away. They noticed as they approached a bay with a beach. By the way, who can guess what the name of this bay is today? St. Paul's Bay. Yes. And they cut off all the anchors on the back, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the the rudders, and hoisting the foresail to the wind. The foresail's the right one to hoist. Why? Because as it pushes the boat, it lifts that bow a little bit. So they're going to be as far inland as they can before they hit the beach. It says, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, probably rocks, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained unmovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. You can imagine the waves just pounding on the back of that. Again, it's going to fall apart in due time. And the other soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners. Why would they do that? Because they were responsible for delivering those prisoners. And if they would try and escape, that was dangerous for them. So Julius, the centurion, kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard. Isn't it remarkable that you would be a sailor and not know how to swim? Why would you do that? I mean, why wouldn't you just take a few lessons? You're going to learn one way or the other. It's either going to be your first lesson or one of your last lessons. But anyway, told him, jump overboard first and make for the island if you can swim. Verse 44, and the rest who could not swim, hold on to planks or pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. And it's why we have gospel songs that talk about being saved from the ocean. Because trusting Christ as your Savior is what's going to save our soul, not from drowning. Drowning's just the first part, folks. If you're not saved, you will not go to heaven. And you can't be saved by trying the best you can to be good. The only way to go to heaven is to have Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. And imagine all these getting safely to land. And so we've already talked about the things we learn about God's control over weather, and also about how to be calm and collected during the most dire circumstances in life. Well, Psalm 107, the same passage that Logan read. I really just want to read two phrases and then the result. Verse 25 in Psalm 107. By the way, this psalm is designed to teach us the loving kindness or the steadfast love of the Lord. Look at the end verse in Psalm 107 and you'll see that. But notice he says that God commanded and raised the stormy wind. I need a storm. It's going to help bring souls to me. And so he creates the storm. And then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distress. He made the storm be still. He did both things. He gives us a lack of peace, so we will turn to him. And then he gives us peace when we do. A peace that passes all human understanding. And so he brought them to their desired haven. That's what he did. He brought them all safely to land. And we find out in chapter 28, Lord willing, next week, that this was a very good thing. But let us thank the Lord for his steadfast love and for his wondrous works to the children of man. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people and praise him in the assembly of the elders. That's what we're doing this morning. Extolling him for who he is and praising him. So, Brother Elias, would you come and lead us in some praise of the Lord?